If you are a middle-aged woman trying to prepare for this road ahead that we call aging, I got you. Welcome to my series, Aging Well for Women Over 40, where all of us together are working through this book by Mayo Clinic Press. It was written by longevity expert Maddy Dychtwald and it's called Ageless Aging. Now we have 2 other episodes, and if you missed those, I will link those down below. But something I wanted to share with you today that I didn't cover in those other 2 videos was an experience that I had recently regarding my own aging, and more specifically my mortality. Now I'm 52 years old. And if you're like me and we're in the middle of our life, we have probably all experienced some sort of loss. Now, if you're new to me, you may not know that I've had a pretty significant amount of loss in my nuclear family, where I've lost my mom and my dad and my brother and my sister all to cancer and disease. But one of those things that I realized is, even though I was in a really heavy caregiving role for them and facing this, I didn't look at my own mortality the way that I did until very recently, where I just felt like the universe finally caught my attention. And I don't know, I just had some kind of moment where I realized that, this is it. We're not messing around here. I'm 50-some years old. I've always wanted to live to be over 100. Now I only want to do that if I can live it well. And if that's the case, though, half of my life is already over. And I was just looking at things a little differently. Maybe even a little bit of fear was mixed in there. And I wanted to share that with you because then I realized, you know what? If that is the case, if I'm lucky enough to be able to live to be 100, then I still have decades of living ahead of me, and likely so do you, right guys? We have a lot of life still left to live, and while there's some things that may be a little bit more scary as we age, there's a lot of fun things and exciting things to look forward to as well. So I really want to share my perspective on that with you here and share 5 key takeaways from chapter 1 of this book, especially if you have some of those feelings, and you'll see why that's important in just a moment. Now, one thing that I want to touch on here is, in the previous video, if you haven't seen that, Maddy shares with us what she calls the gender health paradox. And what that is we as women, we are leading this revolution on longevity. We are the ones that are living longer than men, an average of 6 years. But one thing that Maddy shared that I did talk about in my previous video was we are not necessarily living those extra years well. Not physically, not financially, not psychologically. We're not living the last decade or so of our years well. And so this book that we're working through, where Maddy uses her own decades worth of research and the experts from Mayo Clinic that she had access to, but tons of other experts, many of whom I will share with you here today on longevity and aging, is to help us change that. All right, so my first key takeaway from chapter 1 kind of builds on what I was just sharing with you regarding how I was looking at my own life and mortality. And initially, we may look at aging well as eating the right foods, or making sure we do the right exercise, or maybe there's some supplements we should be taking, things like that to address our physical health. What we may not think about is the way that we believe and think and approach aging can make a big difference as well. So in chapter 1, Maddy talks about ageism. And if you are a middle-aged woman, I know you already have experienced ageism. So it's one of those things that we just know that society looks at us as aging women differently, much more negatively than they do men. It's one of those things that you may not realize, however, that I thought was kind of an aha moment for me, was just how much it's so deeply ingrained in us that we may not realize our own bias with ageism as well. So in chapter 1, my first takeaway I want to share with you is some profound research that Maddy shared from Yale professor and researcher Dr. Becca Levy. Dr. Levy's research showed that people who view and approach aging in a positive manner live to be an average of 7.5 years longer than those who approach it and think about it and believe negatively. That's huge, right, guys? That's a big difference. So my key takeaway number 1, probably the number 1 thing that you could leave this video knowing that you could do to impact your health and longevity, is to maybe check your own bias and look to see if you may be approaching it in a way that's negative. So key takeaway number 1 is how we actually look at aging can have a profound impact on how it unfolds. Now, key takeaway 2 is probably what you think of when you think of aging well, and that would be the science of aging, or the hallmarks of aging. So in chapter 1, Maddy introduces us to these 8 different areas regarding the hallmarks of aging. Now, what I thought was really interesting, my key takeaway number 2 here with regards to these hallmarks, is there is one in particular that seems to be the powerhouse of our lifestyle management, and that would be epigenetics. Now, epigenetics is, if you don't know, it's basically our body's ability to turn on and off certain genes. So hopefully it turns on the good genes and turns off the bad genes. And we'll talk a little bit more about epigenetics. Basically, the rest of the book Again, Maddy will help us better understand these hallmarks of aging and how we can use them to age well. But one last thing I want to share with you regarding key takeaway number 2 and these hallmarks of aging is Dr. James Kirkland is the director of the Center of Aging at Mayo Clinic. And he lets us know that when we target one of these hallmarks of aging, the good news is it seems to have a ripple effect that it positively affects the rest of them, and we can positively impact these hallmarks of aging. Key takeaway number 3 is super quick and easy. In chapter 1, Maddy shares with us the 3 types of aging. Now, the first is our chronological age. And our chronological age is basically just the number of days we have been on this earth. So since the day you were born until now, that's your chronological age. The second one is your psychological age. Now, our psychological age has to do with this normal developmental process that we go through as we navigate life. So we have ups and downs as we experience life, and there is a benefit to that. So the psychological aging Maddy shares is typically viewed positively because even though we may be going through some difficult periods, a benefit through this with psychological aging is we develop things like resilience, or we develop wisdom or perspective. You know, there's great things about being young. Perspective sometimes isn't one of them, right? Or self-awareness, things like that. That will be one of the benefits of psychological aging. Now, the third one is our physical or biological age. This one is associated a lot of times with loss, the loss of our health or strength, our vitality, beauty, fertility, all those different things. It basically has to do with how our body's able to function. Key takeaway number 4 has to do with saying goodbye to the 70-30 rule. Now, what that was is we believed that 70% of how we age was due to our genetics and 30% was due to our lifestyle. We now know that that's just the opposite, that only 30% of how we age has to do with our genetics, and the overwhelming 70% has to do with the way that we're living our lives and our lifestyle. Now, Harvard School professor Dr. John Rowe shares with us that how we age is largely our responsibility. Maddy also shares some words of wisdom from one of my favorite doctors that you've heard me talk about a ton on my channel, and that's Mayo Clinic's Dr. Stephen Kopetsky. Now, he talks a little bit more about epigenetics. Remember, I touched on that in the hallmarks of aging. Dr. Kopetsky was talking about our lifestyle management, that 70-30 rules that we know is no longer the case. And he talks about if we have some predisposition to disease. So, for example, I carry a gene mutation that leaves me at a much higher risk for cancers, the same cancers that took my mom and my brother. Or maybe you have a genetic predisposition for heart disease, maybe cardiovascular disease runs in your family. The epigenetics is so powerful. What Dr. Kopetsky shares in this particular chapter and how lifestyle management makes such a big deal is that we can't change our genetics, right? That's something that we can't do. However, even if we have these genetic predispositions to disease, our lifestyle can reduce that risk by about 75 to 80%. That's epigenetics. So we have a lot that we can do with regards to lifestyle. Knowing how much the lifestyles we're leading can impact how we age leads me to my key takeaway number 5, which is an assessment that Maddy created and put in chapter 1 of her book. So this assessment is a list of over 50 behaviors that either speed up the aging process in our bodies or help slow them down and maybe even sometimes reverse that. So with this assessment, you would look through this list and see which of these behaviors do you do regularly. And then you would tally up the scores and be able to look to see how many you're doing that are accelerating your aging and how many that you're doing that slow it down. Now, the scores are something that she will have you approach without any judgment. She said there's a lot of us running around knowing the right things we should be doing. It's the behavior piece, which of course that's what I specialize in, that can make it harder. So the reason why Maddy put this in is she wants us to really become more aware, which the whole purpose of Maddy's book is to be able to help us age better, and what she refers to as a science as squaring the curve. So what that is, you guys, if you think about aging, we have a curve on how we will age, and maybe health and vitality is at the top, but as we age, that curve is going to go down maybe rather sharply. But if we can institute some of the things that Maddy talks about in this book, we can have that vitality and that health go out longer and not such a dramatic drop off. So I want to thank all of you for allowing me to share my 5 key takeaways from chapter 1 with you. I hope you share yours with me. So if you don't already have Maddy's book, make sure you visit her website today, where it's available on Amazon as well. It's available on Mayo Clinic's website. There is a Kindle version available, whatever works best for you. But make sure you can go and get the book so you can take that assessment and get those resources from Dr. Levy and all those other great gems that we learned here today, and some of the experts as well. So you guys, I really appreciate you letting me share all of this with you here today, and I will see you in the next episode.